What up, friends? I'm James, your host, and welcome to the Music Lounge, where I basically cover everything that I listen to within a given month in 2026. And today we're going to be covering the albums that I listened to and that came out in February. Of course, these are just my general thoughts, opinions, and just general impressions when listening to these records. So, without further ado, let's just get into it. I suppose the first one that we can start with is Bruno Mars's The Romantic. Bruno Mars has been a very interesting case lately. Ever since embracing his throwback sound with 2016 24 Karat Magic, I found him to be a pretty consistent artist despite not having too many albums in his discography. The Romantic, after all, comes a full decade after that project, seeing Bruno a more seasoned musician and artist since then. Of course, he also had the collaboration album with Anderson .Paak called Silk Sonic that was a great album from both of them. It was a suave and fun love letter to the funk, soul, and R&B artists that influenced both of them. However, with The Romantic, I find that this reverie for the influences that Bruno has to be not as interesting or compelling. It's not a bad project per se, but it's a very safe and sanitized one that strips away the cheeky humor that was present on so many songs in Silk Sonic. In fact, this album really does feel a lot like Silk Sonic leftovers, ones that just didn't make the cut, ones that just didn't really hit the same. Unfortunately, a lot of this album is just kind of in one ear and out the other. There are some sort of interesting elements, like there are a few Latin soul influences here and there that I think were pretty fun. They kind of break up the pacing of the album a bit, break up the sound of the album a little bit, but not a lot is actually done with them. The lyrics are also some of Bruno's simplest and most underdeveloped yet. It's just simple, tropey songs about love without any of the humor, charm, and wits that they had when they were sung by Bruno and Anderson in Silk Sonic. The energy of the two musicians bouncing off of each other in that project is also gone here since it's just Bruno on his own, leaving songs that are pleasant but largely unmemorable and don't have a lot of force behind them. Risk It All is a pretty good opener though, I will say, especially in the Latin guitar and brass mixed with some delicate and smooth vocals. It's a very passionate one, and that passion also continues in Cha Cha Cha, and I really like the sort of different vibe that this one has compared to a lot of the other songs on this project, especially in its main bongo beat that it's got going on here. It evokes something a bit more playful, a bit less constrained compared to some of the other songs on the project. Finally, On My Soul is another highlight, really embracing the funk influences that Bruno has and giving this album a nice jolt of energy that I think it kind of desperately needed by this point. I love the groovy guitar on here, the slick organ, and also the very driving beat in the background. Unfortunately, this is where a lot of the interesting moments end. It's not a bad project, like I said. It's fairly pleasant when it's on, but it's not very memorable outside of that, and it doesn't really leave much of a lasting impression. After all is said and done, The Romantic is pretty good, but it just sounds like Bruno coasting on what works rather than trying to really challenge himself or just create something a bit more evocative. Next up, I listened to the newest IVE album, Revive. The IVE girls seemingly never rest. After releasing 2 mini albums last year, they are back again with a full length this time around. IVE are a pretty interesting group. They're kind of like aespa in the sense that they often explore some of the harsher sides of pop music, especially in the sort of dance pop and electro pop sounds that they've been doing lately as well. It's a bit jittery, it's a little bit metallic, it's a little bit harsh, but that kind of makes them fun and makes them have a bit more of an identity compared to a lot of the just straightforward pop songs that we have in the scene. There are actually a lot of great tracks on this record, but the thing that I find the most interesting is the album's structure. It's basically a mini album duct taped to 6 solo songs. In a way, it's almost hard to call it an IVE album because half of the album doesn't even have all the members on it. Either way though, even if it's not totally consistent, I do find that it does have a fairly concise electro-pop and dance pop sound, and even though weaker tracks on this thing don't stray too far from that. The opening 4 tracks on this thing are the best on here for sure. Black Hole and Hush are really going for that aespa, supernova, and savage sound respectively, with the emphasis on the dance beats and very metallic pop sounds. Bang Bang also has an expertly used guitar and a very driving beat that create this almost like spy western sound to it that's probably makes it my favorite on the album, if I'm being honest. Some tracks on the first half of the album don't totally pan out and hit the mark though, and that's mainly Fireworks and Hot Coffee. They're pleasant enough, but also sound kind of dated and sterile compared to the more experimental songs that come before them. The solo songs that come after them also feel a bit more fleshed out and interesting, even if they aren't the most experimental things too. The solo songs in particular have some bangers, but they also kind of vary in quality, I have to say. Wonyoung's 8 is a great and punchy dance track full of confidence. Liso's Super Icy is also a really fun, almost like Britney Spears-esque pop track with the right amount of attitude for a song like this, even if the Snow Bunny line is kinda crazy. Ray's solo In Your Heart is also a fantastic synth pop tune with some great vocal manipulation, some interesting drum and bass beats. Like, this one is really fun. It's very cute yet very punchy at the same time. The other solos are fine, even if they aren't really doing anything super interesting or different. In the case of my girl, Yujin, her solo is okay. You know, the verses are decent and her vocals are as great as ever, but the chorus kind of kills it for me. After all that being said, though, I think the album is pretty great overall. There's a lot of bangers on here with a decent amount of variety too, while not straying too far from the album's core sound. However, some songs are a bit too dated or generic to properly elevate it further. Even if those songs are still fairly pleasant, they don't really do enough or stand out enough to actually bring this album even higher than it could have been. Next up on my list of things that I listened to this month is Mitski's Nothing's About to Happen to Me. Mitski's newest sees her largely continuing the sort of Americana stylings that she experimented with on the 2023 album that came out previously, This Land is Inhospitable and So Are We. Now, admittedly, I am much more of a fan of the indie rock and art pop Mitski as opposed to the Americana and singer-songwriter Mitski. Because of this, it kind of makes my feelings on this album a bit complicated. Lyrically, I think this album is largely as strong as ever. Mitski explores concepts of escapism, bodily autonomy, and the ups and downs of love in pretty interesting ways on this thing. While some songs are written fairly simply, I think they are still pretty effective at capturing how lonely it can be when you feel like nobody understands or appreciates you. Sometimes I actually feel like these simplistic lyrics capture the feeling of being taken advantage of even more. However, my main gripe with this album is the instrumentals. This Land is Inhospitable, while a great record, already wasn't my favorite Mitski album when it comes to instrumentals, and this one largely just strips things back even further. There are moments on this album that come together in a cacophonous awe, but they largely come as an outro to a song that was otherwise pretty instrumentally mundane. Mitski's vocals, while not bad, also aren't really showcasing her talents all that much, especially if we compare it to songs like Liquid Smooth, where she's a vocal powerhouse. A lot of the ideas on this album actually feel like they were done better on the previous album, leaving these ones feeling kind of plain and kind of simple in comparison. In fact, there are a few songs on this album that I swear have borderline identical progression to them. I swear, some tracks on here like Cats Instead of Here and Charon's Orbit, they basically start the exact same way. Like, listen to them. They start basically the exact same way. Not many songs on here really stand out all that much or have much of an identity to them, even if they are pleasant, easy listening. However, the opener, In a Lake, is definitely one of the best songs on this project, as Mitski delivers a passionate critique of small-town romanticism and how she longs to get away to a place where her life isn't already prejudged and her personality isn't already prejudged, where she can kind of disappear. She talks about how a lot of first impressions in small towns are basically how you're seen for the rest of your life, and she also discusses how captive this makes you feel, how imprisoned this makes you feel, how everything is unchanging. The orchestral arrangement sort of stumbling and crashing down near the end of this track, I think, kind of implies how this romanticism essentially shatters once you are no longer part of the in-group, or when you do something that kind of outcasts you from everybody else. Where's My Phone is a simple but nice instrumental change-up, definitely leaning more into the indie rock style of things, basically talking about how she is looking for her phone to escape the horrors of the outside world. I can also appreciate the more somber and darker Dead Women, where Mitski essentially talks about breaking this sort of like womanly ideal, dismantling the sort of trope of the passive wife, passive woman, the old ball and chain idea, I suppose, and how a lot of people, especially more traditional, I guess, communities or ideologies typically don't like it when women start voicing their own opinions and deviating from said ideal. That synthy outro is also just beautiful and brings in a sort of wistful longing into the mix. Finally, I'll Change For You is the last notable highlight for me, almost going for a sort of like jazzy lounge bar vibe as she talks about feeling lonely among strangers and laments how she'll do anything and change herself to get her lover back. There are some gems in here, especially the ones that have more bombastic and extravagant outros, but more often than not, I find that the instrumentals are just kind of too plain and boring to actually capture the intricacies of the lyrics. It's a good album at the end of the day, but it is carried by its lyrics, and I think pretty much everything on here was done better by her last album. Finally, we have the last new album that I listened to in February, Gorillaz' The Mountain. You really have to appreciate the staying power that Gorillaz have. All the different sounds and instrumentals that Damon's played with, all the different storylines and concepts that Jamie Hewlett has created. It's crazy to think how long they've been doing this and how monumental every Gorillaz album release still seems to be. Some weren't as good, I wasn't crazy about Humans, and their previous album, Cracker Island, was just kind of okay. But still, they were fine, and at the end of the day, Gorillaz always seems to bounce back. And bounce back they have. The Mountain is a fantastic addition to their catalog, combining art pop, neo-psychedelia, and even like traditional Hindustani music. It's hard to find a place to begin, to be honest, from the beautiful yet surprisingly catchy opener, the title track, and the sort of somber yet bouncy Moon Cave. The strings, Damon's lamenting vocals, and the heartfelt lyrics that see Damon essentially talking to his deceased father just combine in an extravagant and beautiful way. That brilliant chorus as well, everything just swells in a way that just makes this song basically my favorite on the entire album. That's not even touching upon the other great tracks on this thing, like the surprisingly simple yet catchy Orange County with the whistle beat and the call and response vocals from Damon and Cara Jackson. The ominous and moody The Empty Dream Machine is another highlight too. That one has some incredible bass and like sitar work, as well as Damon croons about lost dreams and the importance of living in the moment. It has a very haunting atmosphere, and Black Thought's verse near the end just helps round out the song perfectly. The manifesto is a very bold one as well. It's essentially a two-parter featuring a Latin pop first half from Trueno and a posthumous verse from Proof in the second half. That verse, just because it's posthumous, really fits with the album's themes, and the jazzy nature to it is just very lush, very clean. I love this track. Again, I think the inclusion of Proof's verse here was very fitting, and I think it was very well done, especially because the entire theme of this album is this journey that Jamie and Damon are taking to find acceptance over the people that they've lost. Damascus and The Shadowy Light are a great 1-2 punch, with the former having a very fun electronic beat and a combo vocals in English and Arabic from Damon and also from Yassine Bey and Omar Suleiman. The latter chills us out a bit, featuring a much more traditional Hindustani sort of instrumental style, as the lyrics basically discuss how, people are chasing wealth, people are chasing power, however, we all have the same end. Asha's vocals on this one are also very powerful and very poignant, as she discusses things like how important the human connection is and how replacing that with things like AI and how the wealthy are treating people like they're disposable. All of this will destroy us. The human condition cannot be replaced with money and power and technology, and the sooner we realize that, the more likely it is that we will actually come together and survive all this hell that we're going through. The album ends on The Sad God, and like Plastic Beach's Pirate Jet, it's a pretty bittersweet end. There is hope in this track, but you can't help but feel how broken the world is in here, and how, unless we learn from our mistakes and we reject this sort of like idealized past that we have to return to, we're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes. In a way, this notion of clinging to the past and not learning anything is actually reflected in the instrumental, as well, as the last part of this track essentially reprises The Mountain from the very beginning. There are some lesser notes on here, like the Happy Dictator and the Plastic Guru, who have beats that feel a bit cheap, maybe not as full and fleshed out as some of the other tracks on this album. Other songs on here can feel a bit samey, maybe a bit like interlude-y, if that makes sense, but these are largely few and far between, and even the ones that I'm not as keen on are still pretty damn good. It's interesting because in a way, it feels like Gorillaz now have like two aisles of music that they go in. They have the more experience-driven, the more storytelling-driven albums like Plastic Beach, Demon Days, The Mountain, and then now they also have more single-oriented albums like Humans, The Now Now, and Song Machine. In the end, I'm kind of glad we have both types, and I feel like now that it feels like we have both types, it's a bit easier to appreciate when Gorillaz does something that isn't so narratively driven, because we'll know that we'll get back to that narrative eventually. Like I said before, this album is fantastic, and a clearly worthy addition to their catalog, I think. Of course, I do discuss album covers on this show, and I guess we could start with Gorillaz' The Mountain. I think this one is a really good cover. It's very simple, you know, it's the characters on the mountain with the text on top, written in native. But I think it's really effective. It has this sort of like muted and like dreamlike color scheme that I think really fits the album's narrative of moving on, acceptance, and things like that. I feel like it fits the more natural and traditional instrumentation as well. So for Gorillaz, I think this is pretty good. It fits the album narratively and instrumentally, as opposed to something like Cracker Island, you know? Now with Mitski's album cover, this one, you know, it's fine. I definitely think it does fit the more like low-key singer-songwriter vibe to it. It definitely feels very warm, almost maybe a little inviting, even if some of the lyrics on this album can get a little dark. I do think it has that sort of like dichotomy of, you know, everything is going to be okay even if things kind of suck, but we have to like keep pushing forward and calling out things that need to be called out to actually make the world a better place. I know that got kind of deep from an album with a cat on it, but I do think it does fit that vibe. Ives' album cover is also pretty interesting too. Compared to a few of their other album covers, this one is definitely a bit more design heavy, which I appreciate. It kind of does have that sort of like almost 2000s era like kind of edge to it that I think is pretty fun. Color scheme is pretty good too. You know, it's all blues. I think it's very consistent in that regard. Some may argue it's a little boring, I suppose, but I think it's bold enough and I think it's striking enough to where it works for the sound that the group has. Finally, we have Bruno Mars' album cover for The Romantic, and honestly, this one I'm a bit less keen on. Again, I guess you can argue that it is fitting because this album cover does feel like Silk Sonic leftovers. It's very similar to the Silk Sonic album cover, except it's white and black instead of a sort of like shade of brown as in the Silk Sonic album cover. So, you know, this one, I get it. I get it, but also, again, it's very safe. It's very sterile, and I don't think it really says much, unfortunately. Finally, let's talk about some of the other things that I was listening to in February, things that didn't necessarily come out that month. So I've definitely been on an electronic and house kick for sure. I've been playing Wipeout a lot, so a lot of the Wipeout soundtracks I have been listening to. I kind of have like a playlist of like basically every Wipeout game soundtrack that I kind of just scroll through. So that one's very fun, especially the songs from the Omega collection, because that's the one I've been playing recently. So I've definitely been listening to a lot of Wipeout soundtracks. I've been really liking the songs from the Chemical Brothers and Cold Storage, especially on this one. You know, I've been following the Chemical Brothers for a little while now, but Cold Storage actually really surprised me. A lot of the tracks that they do are the ones that I typically find myself coming back to. I've also been re-listening to a lot of Underworld lately. You know, Dub No Bass with My Headman, absolute underrated classic. I could listen to that album so many times, but I've also been appreciating Oblivion with Bells and 100 Days Off more than I used to as well. You know, I think Underworld is a very consistent group. But I guess Dub No Bass with My Headman always kind of like superseded everything else for me, but I'm really liking a lot of their other stuff even more now that I've been going back and listening to it. I also recently got into Justice as well with their 2024 album Hyperdrama, so I really need to go back and explore their previous work too. I know, like, I think Crosses was like their big classic, so I'm gonna have to listen to that one as well. But that was everything that I listened to in February. Be sure to give me your thoughts on all of these albums, all of the other things I was listening to. Let me know what you were listening to in February as well. I always like getting introduced to new music and seeing what everybody else is listening to as well, what's been going on with everybody else. But I guess, be sure to like, comment, subscribe if you like what I do. If you want to see more, you can always hit the little bell thingy to get notified whenever I upload. I usually do once a month at least after I get all of the previous months situated at least. But until the next one, farewell.